There's 5 points between the top 5 in the championship. It's all to play for. Hands off the keyboard. Can you tell us the order and the points?
Well, they're tied on points at the moment. It's Victor Martins with 36 and Arthur Leclerc with 36 as well. And after that, as you say, it's the top 5.
Hello and welcome to the F1 Feeder Series podcast, your guide to keeping up to date on everything in the junior single-seater world. I'm your host, Jim Kimberley, and this week we're heading to Spain as the annual so-called European season kicks off for F1 support series Formula 2 and Formula 3. Now, the season is fully underway, and we're going to look back on the season so far and also what to look out for in the coming months. To help me remember what's happened so far, I'm joined by 3 people this week who each have expertise in Formula 3, Formula 2, and something unusual called Formula 1. But let me introduce a man from the Formula 1 world who is the jazzy boots on the ground at all the races this year. He's Formula 1 correspondent, F1 TV presenter, and Channel 4 reporter. And I've probably got other things I've forgotten. Lawrence Barretto, welcome to the podcast.
Sorry, it took you so long to say my job title, but I appreciate you running all the way through it, Jim. I appreciate it. Yeah.
What have I missed? There is something of podcast host.
I think you've got everything. Let's.
Well, thank you for joining, Lawrence. I'm really excited to talk through everything with you. And a change of pace, looking below F1 for you this week, eh?
Yeah. So I try my best when I'm at F1 races to keep an eye on what's going on, but as you'll know, Formula 1 is quite an absorbing sport and it's quite hard to keep across everything, but it's always worth keeping an eye on F2 and F3 just because that's the pathway into Formula 1, and we've seen in recent years that drivers have made the step up all the way through the ladder reaching Formula 1, so I do my best when I can.
Yeah, not all the drivers, like a certain F2 champion last year, but we'll talk about that a little later, I'm sure. Joining Lawrence is a man who also earns his cash from Formula 1, but by talking about Formula 3. It's the man who, at his current trajectory, will be replacing Martin Brundle in about a year or two, Formula 3 commentator Harry Benjamin. Great to have you, Harry. And it's after a weekend where you were concentrating on 2 wheels rather than 4.
Oh, well, thank you very much, firstly, for having me. You're far too kind. No one could ever replace Martin Brundle. Just absolutely a fearless legend. But yes, 2 wheels at the weekend. The Electric Scooter Championship, ESC. It's founded by Lucas di Grassi, of course, you might be familiar with from his Virgin F1 days and more Formula E merits to his name. Alex Wurz is well involved in that first ever round of it in South London, and it's a great little championship. They've got Hulkenberg's got a team, Carlin are involved as well, of course, and in F2 and F3, and now reaching out into electric scooters. It's brilliant, and it went really well, I think, for a first ever event. So it was nice to be involved.
Yeah, very different. I did see some of those very well branded, very well marketed. It was. Videos on the social media, mainly because of you. So good job for that. Finally, though, I have to also introduce, and I'm always happy to have him here, it's the F1 Feeder Series F2 editor, Tyler Foster. Tyler, whenever you join, the podcast always somehow turns to food. Do you have any plans to derail us this week with fellow foodie Lawrence Barretto?
Oh, I know that Lawrence is much more well-travelled than I am, so perhaps. But I've got my food out of the way early. I've finished my nice beef stroganoff that I made, but other than that,
nice.
I'm hoping to just keep it on cars. I mean, you never know with the podcast, but yeah, I'm excited with 2 people. Usually, I'm surrounded by or sandwiched by drivers, but this week I'm with people who I actually, if anything, I hold higher praise for because they're sort of in the genre that I'm involved in. So yeah, it'll be interesting to see what they have to say about things.
What they have to say about food. I will just give a little bit of backstory to those watching and listening. But those of you on watching and listening, I got a picture of the beef stroganoff sent to me before the podcast started. So we derailed it before we even started. And also I saw Harry and Lawrence both give it quite a nod for those of you listening, when he did mention the beef stroganoff. So I'm sure they all are conspiring against me to turn this into the F1 Feeder Series podcast as ever. So thanks for that, Tyler. Before we get started, though, a quick reminder to like, comment, and subscribe if you're watching on YouTube. And if you're listening to the audio-only version, please leave a review on whatever podcast platform you're using. It really does help us out. Now, going to start on Formula 2 because it is the headline act of the Feeder Series world. And let me start with you here, Harry. How much F2 have you kept up to date on this year with your official job change? And have you issued an actual threat to Alex Jakes yet that you're going to steal his F2 comms next year?
Absolutely no threat at all. Alex is, I've watched him for 7-8 years of him doing commentary from GP3, GP2. He's been so brilliant with me as well. He's given me advice. He's sent me, really lovely messages, especially when I filled in for him for the first time last year when he was out in Austria and, COVID was a bit of an issue there. So that was my first sort of break doing Formula 3. And he was nothing but welcoming because, there are very few people that get to be the voice of Formula 3, which is one of the, I'm biased, obviously, but it's one of the most exciting championships going because there's 30 cars on that grid and they're all young, exciting, fast races. And it's a really critical point in their careers. So it's just an honor to be able to follow in the footsteps, really. So no, nothing being issued at all. So yeah, it's been good to do F3. Formula 2, of course, do keep up with that as well, but naturally my main thing at the moment is Formula 3, but it's hard to ignore Formula 2 when that's on, well, straight after.
Yeah, I imagine you're actually doing a lot of preparation or cooling down after Formula 2's on when you finish with your F3 stuff. We've got questions galore about your commentary for it, so it's been very well received. And was it last year you were doing it with, was it Rosanna at Silverstone as well? You jumped in for Formula 2?
Yes, that was very late, actually. I got called on Friday after they'd done practice and qualifying. So I thought I had the weekend off. And then suddenly I was dropped in with Rosanna. And Rosanna, I think it was her first time doing Formula 2 as well, although she'd been doing the Formula 1 commentary. So it was a little bit sort of finding our way in the dark, working together, and then also having to sort of battle our way through Formula 2. But after the 3 races, I think by the end of it, we got the hang of it. But I mean, what a privilege to be able to do Formula 2 for the British Grand Prix as well. That, I mean, just brilliant. And to have, work alongside Rosanna, who I wouldn't normally really get to work alongside. So that's an added bonus as well.
Yeah, out of nowhere as well, all that stuff from the start of the year. I remember speaking to you. I don't think you had any Formula 3 or Formula 2 hopes in your sights at that point. Lawrence, although not strictly Formula 2 anymore, but he's going to be a Formula 2 champion that never made it, or the Formula 2 champion who never made it, unless Oscar Piastri joins him. 2 days ago, not today, 2 days ago, Nick de Vries was announced that he's going to make an F1 appearance for Williams at Barcelona. What did you know about this welcome news?
Well, I didn't know that it was going to happen in advance, but I do know that Williams have had an eye on Nick for a while now. He was obviously in the running to get the seat that Alex Albon eventually got at Williams for this season. So he's always been on their radar. And part of the Formula 1 rules this year is that every team have to run a young driver for at least 2 FP1 sessions. And it makes sense for them as they're evaluating what they're going to do going forward next year to take a driver who they were considering, or at least are of interest to them in one of those sessions, particularly in Spain, where they obviously run so much time in pre-seasons. They know the circuit very well. They've got a lot of data points. They can make those comparisons. And I'm sure that, as their engine supplier and their technical partner, Mercedes, and Nick's obviously a reserve driver for Mercedes, I'm sure that a lot of that is intertwined, and they collectively want to make a decision about, whether or not he can make it into Formula 1 next year. I think, if I'm right in saying, Mercedes are leaving Formula E at the end of the current season. And so Nick's going to need something, going forward. I'm not saying he can't join another team in Formula E, but I think, he still has aspirations, if he can, of making it into Formula 1 and getting him in. It's mad to say this is his first Grand Prix weekend that he's going to be taking part in. He obviously did the Abu Dhabi post-season test, but it's mad to say that this is his first one. I spent a bit of time with him last year because he, in his reserve role, he was often rolled out as a pundit on a lot of the F1 TV things that we did. So I got to know him a little bit, and really impressive guy. Gets on really well with the team at Mercedes, and I imagine he'll settle in super quick with Williams, who are like a family operation who will bed him in quickly. And so I'm intrigued to see what he'll do, not from a lap time point of view, but just in terms of how well he beds into the team, what the feedback is like, what they think of him, because he'll be doing a program that won't facilitate impressive lap times. But I'm intrigued to see what he can do.
I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit here because you are the one who's going to have this F1 knowledge. What's the situation at Williams with their contracts for next year? Are both drivers out of contract, and is Nick in with an actual realistic chance, should he shine at Barcelona, of taking one of those seats?
So as I understand it, Nicholas Latifi's contract comes up to expire at the end of this year. So that seat is available. In terms of Alex, they signed a long-term deal. So barring anything dramatic, he'll most certainly be in the car next year. So I think the seat that we would be talking about will be Nicky's. Nicky's been there 3 years, or will have been there for 3 years. The team have a lot of respect for him. He's obviously struggling to adapt to these 2022 cars. He is very open and saying that he can't quite get a handle of them, and you can see the frustration for him. But him and his family have been very supportive of Williams and the team when they were in difficult times. And if he can get on top of it, then I still think that, he's not out already at the end of this year. But I think it's sensible for Williams to evaluate all their options, because they are a much more credible proposition these days with Dalton backing them. Alex is showing what you can get out of that car. He's out driving that car, and he's really delivering. So I think there are going to be drivers who are going to want to compete for Williams in years to come. So it makes sense from Williams' side to try other drivers out. It kind of maybe will put a little bit of pressure on Nicky to hopefully up his game, and I'm sure he is capable and get on top of that car. So it'll be interesting to see what they do going forward. But yeah, there is options. There is options at Williams next year.
Interesting, isn't it? The only thing we can say with certainty, it sounds like there's going to be a Nick in the car next year, but it's quite welcome, I think, I saw everybody nodding again for the benefit of everybody listening only. Nick de Vries is one of those drivers like Piastri this year that just seems to have fallen by the wayside. And I'm not going to do my usual crapping on Formula E a little bit, because he's obviously done so well there, but it's an odd route, Tyler, isn't it, to getting to potentially F1 by taking how many years out doing Formula E?
Well, I've got to be honest, he is my favourite motorsport driver. I don't know what it is. It's just, I remember watching the whole Formula 2 season, and because he was in Formula 2 for 3 or 4 seasons before he was champion. So he had that experience, but he was still quite young when he won it. And I remember that championship winning season, he was so dominant.
Ahead of Latifi as well.
Exactly. And I think he broke the record at that point for maybe the most amount of points in Formula 2 history. And it was so impressive. And then there was that situation where, lack of seats, and then he has to move into Formula E. And yeah, it is a really, really weird way to go about it. But I think when you've got the talent of someone like Nick, I think the thing is he's similar to Stoffel. The work ethic is so strong. I was speaking to Jake Hughes, last week. And he was obviously the Mercedes EQ Formula E development driver. And he works very closely with Nick and Stoffel. And he says just how hard they work at the details, the specifics. And I think that's the sort of thing that would help Nick get into a seat like that. But the other thing to remember about Williams as well, they've got Logan Sargent on their books in Formula 2, someone who's had a decent start to the season, someone who I reckon probably will have a building year for Formula 2 this year. And then next year, we'll be looking at possibly fighting for the title. And he's with Carlin, a team who have been really strong this year. So that Williams seat or seats, especially with other seats and other teams, could be one that maybe changes once or twice over the next 2 or 3 years. So yeah, certainly one to watch for that.
Yeah, crazy stuff. And somehow, Tyler, you're suggesting that Roy Nissany isn't going to take that seat, but I won't press you too hard on that. We are going to get busy with Formula 2, though. 3 races in 4 weekends, I think I calculated it as. What are some of the storylines so far this season for people to keep an eye on? And maybe just for the benefit of Lawrence Barretto, who might take some time out to watch a Formula 2, you can let him know what to look out for.
A lot of pressure on my shoulders then. I think the main point I would issue to people who haven't fully watched Formula 2 or have caught bits here or there is not who's leading the championship or anything like that. it's Pourchaire by 2 points over Felipe Drugovich. But the main thing of interest for me is that of the top 7 drivers currently in the standings, only one of them has got pole position, which means that two of the drivers that have got pole position are outside the top 7, which means that, for whatever reason, it's very open. And there are a lot of rookies. Almost half the grid this year are rookies. That's something that I keep going on about, because we went into the season not knowing whether we'd have a Piastri situation where someone who was a rookie would come in and win the championship. At the moment, it looks like it's probably someone going to be more experienced, because the top 3 are Pourchaire, who's in his second year, Drugovich, who I believe is in his third season, and Ruvela, who's again an experienced driver. So it's going to be one for the experienced drivers, in my opinion. But Pourchaire's winning feature races, that's what's key in at this level. That's where the points are. He's won 2 out of the 3 so far. Yuri Vips had a really disappointing Imola, where he got pole and then put it in the gravel. A lot of drivers did that at Imola, which was really interesting to see, because you don't usually get that in Formula 2, where multiple drivers make key mistakes in sort of a way that costs you victory. It seems like the season's been more comparative to Formula 3 in the way that it's been very up for grabs and very random. But it's very exciting, because of the amount of really strong drivers there are on the development books of Formula 1 teams. So, Red Bull have got 5 drivers. Mercedes have got Frédéric Vesti. You've got, as I mentioned, Nissany, and you've got Logan Sargent as well. So a lot of really good drivers, but it's been very open and still such a long way to go.
Drivers falling off the track, like you said the last time with Vips at Imola. Harry, we'll come to you in a little bit to talk about that. You saw plenty of that action in Formula 3, because those Imola races were absolutely terrific. I don't know how you managed to call the last laps there. You mentioned, Tyler, about the drivers on the F1 team's books. Now, Lawrence, I know you know everybody in the paddock, and the championship leader, Theo Pourchaire, is tightly tied to Sauber and Fred Vasseur. How highly does Vasseur rate the Frenchman?
Oh, hugely. I think, Fred really wants him in one of his cars in the future. I think if he had his way, he would have had him in already. I think he's probably taken the smarter route and letting him bed in a little bit more and get some experience in the lower formulae before he makes the step up. I think Fred's going to have a problem, though, because he's obviously got Valtteri, who's performing at an incredibly high level, as I'm sure Fred expected. But Joe has come in, and I think he's surprised everyone with his consistency, his ability to settle into the team and give articulate feedback to the crew. He's getting on so well with Valtteri. And I think that it's going to be a very difficult one for the team to want to part ways with him, which means it is not entirely clear where Pourchaire would go. If Fred wants to, say he goes and wins the F2 title this year, it's not entirely clear where he'd go, and they're going to have a problem like Alpine have with Piastri this year. And there's just not enough seats on the grid at the moment. But Fred rates him really highly. I think you often talk about to team bosses, and they talk about young drivers coming through, and they say positive things, and they say, I'd love to see them in the top team in Formula 1 in the future. But the way that Fred talks about Pourchaire is slightly different. Like, he genuinely believes, he's invested in him, and he believes he's the future. So it will be interesting to see how he does in F2 this year, and then how they find a way in the years coming up to find a place for him. Who knows? There's lots of contracts up for renewal in Formula 1 over this winter, and so that there's always opportunities. You can always find a solution if you really, really want to. So it'll be interesting to see how that all plays out. But firstly, I guess Pourchaire's just got to go and win this title, and then that will make Fred's job slightly easier.
It sounds like it'll be slightly hard. I know, Tyler, you've got a few thoughts on this as well.
Yeah, I wanted to ask Lawrence about Mercedes specifically. Obviously, they're probably the team, even if you're a Red Bull or a Ferrari fan, that are the most confusing in terms of F1 this year, with the car, the potential that they've possibly got in that, and then the situation with Russell and Hamilton. But the thing is that from a feeder series perspective, they're also a really confusing team, because their main driver in the feeder series categories is Frédéric Vesti, who's been there for a while now and is in his rookie season in F2, and I believe he's 21 years old. And he's having an okay season. He's scored, he has had 1 point finish in the feature race in Imola. but he's down in 16th in the standings. It doesn't look like he's going to be, anywhere near fighting in, say, the top 5, top 6, top 7 in F2. Is there any inclination, perhaps, that with Hamilton's situation possibly unclear for the future, in terms of how many years he's going to remain in Formula One, that Mercedes are branching out their ideas for young drivers? Because the question is, who's next for them if Hamilton goes?
I think that they're fortunate in that they've got a bit of time, because even if Lewis goes, and I'm not saying that he will, but should he go, they wouldn't take someone that young anyway. They'd probably take experience from within the grid, and then we're talking 3, 4, 5 years down the line, hopefully they'll have brought through someone by then. And we saw it, George, like, he only pushed his way into that team because he was so impressive at Williams. And even then it took 3 years. So I would have thought most drivers that they bring through are going to take that at least. And they were fortunate in that they had such a great cooperation with Williams, which meant that they had somewhere to place their young drivers. I imagine, and I don't know this, but I imagine Mercedes would have thought that Vesti would have been a bit stronger at this point by now, and that he would have been knocking on the door a little bit harder. But they announced, a suite of drivers at the start of this year, and it was very much grassroots level up. So it shows that they're taking more of a long-term view on these things. And, we've seen drivers like Pascal Wehrlein. I remember when he was coming through as Mercedes Junior, and Esteban Ocon, and they genuinely, they wanted those two to get into the works team. And then very quickly things change. And, Esteban's ended up going down the Alpine route. Pascal never really made the step up and has left the sport. So as highly as you rate a young driver when they're coming through, and I genuinely think the teams are genuine when they say that, we believe these guys are good, time changes, things move so quickly in Formula One that even the best might not always get their shot. So it's an interesting time for Mercedes. Like you said, they've got a lot going on at the moment. Primarily they need to sort their performance out, but they will always be looking at bringing the next level through, and it isn't entirely clear where that's going to come from. But I don't think they'll have a shortage of drivers that they will need to choose from should Lewis retire in the future. I think they've got 5, 6, 7 drivers within Formula One where even if they're struggling now, people would bite their hand off to drive for them.
Yeah, well, they've got Antonelli, who I know, Jim, you're going to talk on about later, who's probably the key one in that bracket. So
yeah, well, in the interest of moving forward, because we've got so much to go through, there is that point which we'll get to, because I know a lot of the feeder series fans will be screaming right now thinking, well, there's a very clear candidate for a few years away, but like Lawrence said, it's grassroots level. But more on that to come. Harry, you've been quite quiet because we haven't been speaking about Formula 3 so much yet, and we're going to move on to F3. There's 5 points between the top 5 in the championship. It's all to play for. You're the point man now, Harry, the go-to guy, the man who knows every statistic, hands off the keyboard. Can you tell us the order and the points?
Well, they're tied on points at the moment. It's Victor Martins with 36 and Arthur Leclerc with 36 as well. And after that, as you say, it's the top 5.
I will let you off. We've got Roman Stanek, 33, Jack Crawford, 32, Isaac Hadjar. How have you enjoyed commentating it so far this year? And how good's a championship when it's that tight at the top?
I love it. I love every single minute of it. And it's bizarre. I find it bizarre that I'm doing it. When I watch the videos back on like Instagram or whatever and see the clips they use, especially that last lap in Imola where it all kicked off right at the end.
Which last lap?
Well, which last lap indeed? Where Ollie Behrman and Isaac Hadjar and Gregoire Saucy. I just think, Harry, how did any words come out of your mouth that were somewhat logical? Because it all just happened in a corner and suddenly Stanek's won and that's it. And we're all done and breathed and calmed down. I love every minute of it. Bahrain was really good actually, because it was tough because I was on my own for that one, and calling 30 cars on your own is quite difficult, no matter how much you know, and especially because that was my first proper really Formula 3 commentary where I've been able to do some homework beforehand. So that was tough, but I thought the racing was great, and actually the storylines sort of reveal themselves, because there's no way that even the TV director can't really keep up with 30 cars. So, you've just got to somehow be able to tell the story as much as you can with the help of a timing screen as well, which does certainly help when you've got a huge grid of cars. And then, and that's sort of how it's been going so far. We've only had, 2 rounds, 4 races. It feels like we've had way more than that, actually, because we've packed so much action in. There's been so many protagonists that have come to the forefront, and those that have, Victor Martins, especially last time out, who is the highest returning driver, was a little bit of no man's land, really, after looking so dominant in Bahrain. So it's really flipping, and it's hard to tell, who's coming through. The rookies, over half the grid is brand new, and they're all mightily impressive. You can't call it.
It has been terrific. I really enjoyed Formula 3 the most last time out with Imola. It was terrific. Lawrence, Leclerc is joint at the top of the table, although without a win and only one podium finish. It's a famous name. We obviously see there's a lot of interest from Ferrari and Charles whenever Arthur does well. Do you think there's expectation for Ferrari in particular for him to emulate his brother and make his way up?
I think Charles doing a really good job of trying to take the pressure off him. I think he does it very subtly, and he's exactly the kind of support that I think Arthur will need, because there's going to be so much pressure if Arthur makes it into Formula One. Considering the trail that Charles has blazed so far. But I think that, that the dynamic that they have between them is really strong. Is he in Ferrari's eyesight? Well, they've got so many, haven't they, at the moment? Ferrari are blessed, and they're probably the team who I think are going to struggle to get everyone through the door, because at the moment they've got arguably one of the best, if not the best lineups in Formula One, and it's one that's a long-term one. And that's almost difficult for those below. You could say Mick Schumacher, Callum Eilert obviously hasn't made it through. There's Robert Schwartzman is there or thereabouts, but it must feel like the door is shut at the moment, and that must be particularly frustrating. Arthur, I think, has got a bit more time on his hands, which I think is great, and you don't know what the cooperation will be between Ferrari and Haas and Ferrari and Alfa Romeo going forward as well. So I think if you're a Ferrari junior, you're probably feeling a bit more comfortable about how things are, because you've got opportunities to get into Formula One with those 2 other teams before you have the opportunity to potentially drive for Ferrari. But of course, Ferrari's junior program is really strong. Since Mattia's kind of taken over, and he's put a lot of effort into that side of things. Jock Clear's playing a huge role in that area, and he's a very impressive character, full stop. So if he's in charge, he's going to get the very best out of them. And I think that, with the kind of scope that they're given and the funding that they're putting into it, Arthur must feel like he's in a pretty good shape if he can deliver in Formula 3.
I think also it's worth saying as well that with Ferrari having that amazing academy leading to Formula One, yes, there's going to be a point where there's just no room, as you say. But if the young drivers are smart, they'll know that actually they could have, if Formula One doesn't become a reality, I know no F3 or F2 driver really wants to hear that, but there will come a point where you have to make a decision. And if you're being backed by Ferrari, they've got GT programs, they've got a new hypercar program coming in the World Endurance Championship. You could have a really strong, lucrative career with Ferrari backing you in sports cars, but you've still got to perform at the level you're at now, whether you're in F3 or F2. So that's the brilliance, I think, of what Ferrari have over maybe some of the other academies at the moment, where they have that sports car. They're investing lots more into it, especially with this new hypercar thing. I think Giovinazzi might be in with a shot of that as well. So they don't, even if they cast aside a driver for the moment, they don't tend to sort of keep them out completely, which I think is a benefit.
The thing with that as well is you mentioned about the options that they have. It takes someone like Marcus Armstrong, who was sort of waiting for his chance and never really performed in F2 as he was expected to, and then he ended up losing that opportunity with the Ferrari Driver Academy. And it's that thing of, you have got a really short window, and for a lot of drivers, some come in really early, some come in a bit later, and you don't really know when that window will expire. And we've seen some drivers. I mean, Nick, will he get that chance? Will he not? who knows? There's so many drivers, and with hope that Andretti are going to make their way into F1 hopefully in the next few years, that will alleviate some of the pain that some of those drivers might feel.
If I were asking me, I think McLaren's the one you want to be at the moment. The amount of teams that they're going to have in a couple of years, it's insane. You'll find a seat somewhere at some point. It just boggles the mind of how wide they're spreading themselves. Moving back onto F3 though, Tyler, last time you were on, I think it was the last time you were on, we had Franco Colapinto, and he won last time out in the sprint race after the other wild lap, which Harry alluded to. Despite their position in F2, Van Amersfoort are showing their credentials, joining F2 and F3 this year. Are you surprised by how well they've done so far?
Well, I remember being asked at the beginning of the season what I thought they would do in terms of predictions for both F2 and F3. And I thought that they would be a strong midfield team, but I didn't think that they'd be able to fight at the front. And I've spoken to Jake Hughes, as I mentioned earlier, and had the opportunity to speak to Franco a few weeks ago. And they both gave the impression that even in F2, they're raising a lot of eyebrows for other teams. And I think the thing is that compare them to a team like HWA, who came over from DTM, dominating in DTM and moving into Formula 3 and Formula 2 is a completely different story from dominating in, say, the Formula 4s and moving a step up. It's a lot easier. The main difference, other than obviously the chassis, is the tyres, because they don't use Pirellis below Formula 3. And that's pretty much it. So it's a lot easier for teams like Van Amersfoort to make their way in. And because of their excellence in the lower categories, they've taken the brilliance of some of the drivers that they've got. Jake Hughes is highly experienced, and they've used that. And then with the talent of someone like Colapinto, they've used that. And, he had that pole. Now he's got the race win. They're a really strong team. I don't think in Formula 2 they'll be able to, say, fight for drivers or teams championship. But who knows, F3, with how things are so open, I'd like to see what Harry says about that for F3, because I haven't been able to keep fully up with it. But I know for F2, they've certainly raised eyebrows. And I think Jake Hughes said that if they don't win a race by the end of the season, he'll be disappointed, which I think says how good they are.
I'll let Harry respond to that.
Well, I think I would echo those sentiments. I wasn't actually too surprised, especially in Formula 3, with how competitive VAR were. Because the year before, last year, I was doing Euro Formula Open, which is essentially sort of a Spanish Formula 3, if we're ripping it back to its basics. And they have been mightily competitive in that, with current, Rafael Villagomez, who is one of their drivers in Formula 3, also raced with them in Euro Formula Open. So got to know him a little bit, and the management team, and it's Fritz Van Amersfoort, who heads up the whole company. And as you say, Tyler, they're in Formula 4 and beyond. They've been knocking at the door for F3 for some time. They wanted to be in it for a while now, and they finally get that opportunity. And I think it just goes to show, because the management structure that they have there, I think, is mightily impressive. And they know how this works. But it's really difficult to pinpoint, because then you flip it on its other side and you look at Carlin, for instance, a massively well-respected British-run team, incredibly competitive in multiple feeder series, but it hasn't quite clicked with them in Formula 3 for some reason, even though Trevor Carlin is there, sat on the pit wall, trying to figure out what to do. And I spoke with him a few weeks ago, and he's very keen. He doesn't blame his drivers. It's not the drivers' fault at all. He said it's something within our team. He's been changing out engineers, changing the management style, trying to figure out what it is and how to get the most out of these F3 cars and teams, because the way the championship is run and the way the format is currently, it means that you've got to be able to carry momentum, not just on track, but in sort of your backroom staff as well. And if things aren't clicking, it very easily unravels. And at the moment with VAR, I think they've got a fairly strong driver lineup in F3. Franco Colapinto is one of my stars so far. I think he just needs to get a bit more experience under his belt, and then he could be a serious contender, I think. But that's how it sees. That's how I see it at the moment, anyway. But VAR, I think, certainly will be up there in Formula 3 for a long while to come.
There's so many questions I had prepped, but everyone's giving such good answers. I'm going to skip ahead a few here. I just want to know this one for you, Harry, because I would kick myself if I didn't ask it. I texted you before the season to wish you luck, and I also made sure, because I'm just that kind of friend, that you had some crofty level of facts, and you spurted some stuff out about Ayrton Simmons, I think it was. How much trivia sits in your head, and what are some of the best lesser-known facts about the F3 drivers on F3 teams?
Well, I do have an emergency 30-page Google document for those situations that I can quickly get up. If there's a rain delay, quickly, what do I need? The Ayrton Simmons fact was good, but partly because I didn't realize he lives about 20 minutes away from me. So I actually met up with him before we start the season just to sort of, get to know him a bit and have a coffee or whatever. And he was telling me how, he speaks fluent Spanish. He races under a British license, but he speaks fluent Spanish because his mum was Spanish and his dad was English, and he lived in Spain for, I think, the first 7 years of his life. And Ayrton is the only name that sounds the same in Spanish and English. And his dad was a racing fan, so they wanted to call him Ayrton. And so I thought, well, that's a bit of pressure, isn't it? But he doesn't feel that. And also I think he said, unfortunately he wasn't there in Imola, I think due to budget issues, and that's a certain thing he struggles with, because during the day, Monday to Friday, he's working as a electrical engineer, just locally, which was fascinating. The backstories to these drivers, especially when they're still carving their way through, is really interesting. My other fact that I do have off the top of my head, because I do ask all the drivers and their PR people to send me random weird facts that I can whack out just in case I ever need it. One was for Zach O'Sullivan, the reigning GB3 champion, stepping up into Formula 3, of course, backed by Williams as well this year.
Of course, been on the podcast, that guy.
Yes, absolutely, of course. He's had the same engineer all throughout his feeder series. So the engineer he has at the moment is the same engineer that he had in GB3, and it's the same engineer that he had in British F4 before that, which I thought was quite an interesting fact. So how much time has that killed? A few minutes. So and then you talk to Alex Brundle, and he starts filling for a few minutes while I find something else to talk about. And that's how a rain delay works.
Well, I'll give you this one for free because I spoke to Gabriel Mini, who no doubt will be joining F3 at some point next year, if not the year after, that when I interviewed him recently, he can tell me he does a Rubik's Cube in under about 20 seconds. So write that one down for the future, Harry.
20 seconds?
That's too quick.
That's
too quick. That won't last. That won't last.
He's a quick driver. What can I tell you? He's quick with the Rubik's Cubes. I might be exaggerating the 20 seconds, but it's pretty damn quick. I'll need to check the transcription and maybe put a correction out before his management tell me off. There's one last thing I have to talk about before we move on to Ask F1 FS, for quite a brief one, because we've been talking so much. And that's some races I'm sure that none of the panel have watched. Formula 4, and specifically ADAC. In the interest of time, I won't spend too long here, but I did feel the need to pause for a second and appreciate a historic event in ADAC history. Mercedes Junior driver, which, thank you, Tyler, for bringing that up earlier, Andrea Kimi Antonelli, completely dominated the weekend in Hockenheim, taking both pole positions and all three fastest laps. Not to mention doing something that only F2's Dennis Hauger has done in the championship. He won every race over the weekend, all three races, both pole positions, all three fastest laps. And I think he started on the third row of the grid for the final race as well, and then won by 4 seconds still. Unbelievable dominance. So that means so far he's had 5 wins in 6 races, and his rookie teammate Rafael Camara is the other person who won, and the two of them are now over 50 points ahead of P3 in the championship, even though we're only 2 rounds in. It's absolutely amazing. And if you do want to know a bit more about that, there's a little plug here for last week's pundit, Alex Studikov. So go on to f1feederseries.com to read more about that and just look at that little link for the ADAC F4 Championship. Really, really good stuff. And I can't wait to answer the question from 20 minutes ago, just how good Andrea Antonelli is going to be for Mercedes when he inevitably replaces Lewis Hamilton in 2025.
His dad is a very good racing driver as well. He still races. He's an AM category driver in GT Open, and is very fast. So it clearly runs in the blood in that family.
There's a lot of stuff with this racing that everyone just seems to run in the blood. The other person you mentioned as well with the pole position, Tyler, was Mr. Doohan, who of course has racing in his blood as well. So it's just one of those funny things. As much as we could ask questions all day, F1 Feeder Series isn't for us, it's for you. And we want to make sure you all feel involved. So we're moving on to the part of the podcast where our viewers and listeners have their say with hashtag AskF1FS. If this is your first time watching or listening, you can get involved by using the hashtag AskF1FS on Twitter, joining our Discord and using the podcast questions channel, or simply commenting on our YouTube videos and asking whatever it is that's on your mind. This one is kind of tied to what you were saying earlier about age, Tyler, actually. This comes from AS19, Alex, who was a pundit last week, and wants to know, to both of you, Harry and Lawrence, do you find it a shame that you have to be 19 or 20 to make your debut in F1 nowadays, meaning drivers such as Gregoire Saucy might never get a look in? I'll go to you, Harry, first.
That's a tough one, because it's not just in Formula One, the way that's going. You know, people, it's younger and younger globally in jobs, really. It's just a trend that seems to go. I actually watched an interview the other day. I think it was actually Crofty interviewing Benedict Cumberbatch, who was hosting the Laureus Sports Awards back in 2013 or whatever. And they were talking about Sebastian Vettel winning 4 times a world champion at just the age of 26. And I remember Cumberbatch said, you know, I can't believe that he's not just only a Formula One driver at age 26, but he's a 4-time world champion. And then you listen to that conversation now and you go, well, that's old. He's over the hill. You know, it is a shame. But I hope, I like to think that if you've got the raw talent and the backing, then that shouldn't, how old you are, shouldn't affect your rise up through the ranks. If you showcase you are fast enough, if you've got the financial backing, if you've got the know-how and the political awareness, you should still stand just as much of a chance as the 18-year-old that's in the car next to you.
Yeah, I'd agree with you, Harry. Yeah, I feel for them because it is harder now. But Esteban Ocon, Alex Albon have proved that you can leave Formula One and then come back again. And so it proves that if you've got the talent, like Harry said, and you have got that support network, finance is important, but if you've got that support network, if you've got a Mercedes backing you, an Alpine backing you, you've got someone who believes in you, you can find your way through. The interesting thing is these days, you've got such long careers in Formula One, much longer than we've ever seen before. And that just means that with 20 seats on the grid, it's even harder, regardless of what your age is, to make it into Formula One. And Formula One teams like consistency. They don't like changing things up because obviously then you add an extra variable into a championship, which could be really tight. So it's even harder now to break through, regardless of how old you are. But yeah, I'd agree with that. As long as you're good enough and you've got the talent, and things just fall your way, there's definitely luck involved. George got a seat at Mercedes because things just worked out at the right time. Mercedes realised that was the time that Bottas moved on and George comes up. You've just got to be at the right place at the right time. We've seen Fernando Alonso come back into Formula One, and he's the oldest, one of the oldest, and was the eldest on the grid. So I think there is opportunities if you are good enough.
Like a Fernando Alonso who joins in the young drivers test, of course, so he might jump in one of those FP1 sessions that we mentioned. Harry, this one's directly to you. This is from a Viral Srivastava, who wants to know, how do you rate Kushmani's performance so far this year? He's judged it as fast but unlucky, if that's even a thing. Would you agree?
Yeah, I would agree with that. Actually, he's one of the drivers who I have been really quietly impressed by. Especially, he had a year out last year, so not having too much current racing under his belt, really fought to get that seat at MP as well. And I think he got penalised in Bahrain because he came into the pit lane during practice or qualifying, got called for the weighbridge but missed it. So, a stupid mistake, but one that he paid the price for because he then had to start from the back of the grid for both of the races, despite qualifying in the top 6 on outright pace. And during that first, in both races in Bahrain, coming from the pit lane, he made up about, I think it was 12 or 13 positions. And that is impressive in Formula 3. And then he finally gets a decent shout in Imola, although the weather played a bit of havoc. He got a bit caught up. I think I can't remember what happened in the sprint race, but it was all a bit of mayhem at one point, of course, in Formula 3. But he did manage to get 5th place in the feature race, which reflects your qualifying pace and speed, I think. So a few more races under his belt. Kush, right up there with the other rookies, doesn't look out of his depth, and that's the main thing, I think.
I think that's the point of Formula 3, isn't it, to make those sort of errors. So should he make it to F1, you don't miss the weighbridge. That's kind of what happens. Just whiz to this one. This isn't specified anybody. I'm going to point at you for this, Lawrence. This one comes from Stein, who has the amazing, not the first time he's asked a question, but it has the amazing Twitter handle, Dennis_Hauger. I don't know how he's got away with that, but well done. Is W Series unneeded if the biggest stars, presumably talking about Jamie Chadwick, can't make it through to other series? I know it's a difficult one to throw at you, Lawrence, but it is a question that's been raised, and we've asked it last week and the week before.
No, I think you need W Series. I think it's a great initiative. I think it gives an opportunity for young women, for girls to see that there is a chance to break it into into motorsport. I think that up until a few years ago, maybe just before CC Wolf was on the scene, it probably looked very difficult, or not even like a career that many girls would have wanted to pursue. And I just think the very fact that you've got something like the W Series and you've got a proper competitive championship on telly that people can watch, young girls can watch and grow up and aspire to be, I think is hugely important. And okay, it's not ideal that Jamie hasn't managed yet to make that step up into the main ladder, but that doesn't mean that it won't happen in the near future. She's still clearly a very strong racing driver. Williams have got a relationship with us. They clearly rate her to an extent as well. So I think, let's not forget the W Series is still a very young series. It's only just starting, just getting started really. It's on the Formula One bill now, which I think is huge. It shows the support for the championship. These things are going to take time. I know it's almost annoying to say it, but it might take a decade or more. But that's just the way it will work, because if you want to bring young people through from grassroots, it takes time. They have to grow up, they have to get life experience, they have to get the experience behind the wheel. So it's going to take a little bit of time. But I absolutely think W Series is needed, and I hope that it continues to grow.
Another question that's kind of tied to the, I would call it, equality element of it, that CM Parfait 16 regular question asker wants to know, hello, Lawrence, what are your thoughts about the lack of success / opportunity of non-Japanese, Asian-based and African drivers when it comes to the F1 ladder? I know we're just talking on this at the back of the Kushmani conversation, but it's a fair point as well that it's an international sport, motorsport, getting to F1, but it's not international with some regards.
I think this kind of goes back to the fact that Formula One or competing in motorsport is expensive, and so it's just not feasible for, if a young kid wants to enter sport, they can, if they want to do football, they can just go and buy a football and kick it around, but you can't then just go and buy a go-kart and all the fresh tyres you need and then go down to your local kart track, and that's if you've got a local kart track near enough. So it's much harder already to believe that you can even just get your foot in the door and experience if it's a sport that you like. So you mentioned, Japan, of course, they've got Super Formula, they've got a great kind of racing commitment and ladder over there already. I think that what Formula One as a whole is trying to do is, it's on the subject of diversity inclusion, is they're just trying to make Formula One as a sport more open, and that's across driving, marketing, sponsorship. If you want any way of working in Formula One, any job in Formula One, the idea is that we should, over the next 10, 15, 20 years, make it more feasible for people to get the skill sets that they need to then get into Formula One. And I think over the time, as we kind of try and progress this kind of area, we'll find a way to support young drivers across the world. Like you said, it's a global world championship. So, it's not just about trying to get a race in Africa so we can call ourselves a world championship. It's trying to get the opportunity for everyone around the world, if they want to enter motor racing and they are good enough and they're talented enough, that they have that chance. But it's going to take time. It's going to take years. But I do think it is frustrating, and I take that point that if you're not in one of those core areas, so Europe, for example, of, like you said, in Japan, it's difficult. I remember Vijay Mallya, I'm pretty sure when he was running Force India, he did a scheme called 1 in a million or 1 in a billion, where he was trying to get young drivers through, and he set up kind of like a karting championship locally. It's just a really hard thing to get off the ground in an area where maybe people aren't where it's competitive. Cricket is huge in India. It's hard when Formula One or motorsport isn't the number one sport anyway, and then you want to get this new championship off the ground. So it's a difficult one, but I'd like to think over time we'll find a way where it's just more opportunity, I think, and hopefully more sponsors will be able to put money behind projects to back more drivers.
It's like turning a massive tanker the size of a F1 2022 car, isn't it, trying to make this change at the moment? So completely understand. Harry, this one's for you. If you could do quickly, that would be great, because there's a question I really want to ask. This one is from Josh via Discord, who wants to know, how can you tell who is who in the chaos of lap one?
Well, you get it wrong sometimes. And I mean, you become more familiar with it as obviously you get more experience. Like Imola, I was lap 1 Bahrain. It was, I tend to just focus on who's at the front. I make sure I know exactly who the front 4 cars are. Their numbers distinguish them. Their livery distinguish them. Although in Formula 3, there's about 8 cars that are all black and white, which is super helpful. So that's how I usually distinguish it. It's usually number, livery, and especially on lap 1, I can't focus on the whole grid, so I just go, well, I'm going to absolutely nail who's at the front and make sure that's the main battle we get running, and then it's a lot of looking at on track, looking at timing screen, how does it add up, and then just sort of fly the seat of your pants kind of thing and hope it works out.
Yeah, I do notice, and I think it's to your advantage. It's like, and that's the number 21 car going off, rather than getting it completely wrong and saying number 21 is whoever that is. So I think you do a terrific job so far, Harry. So long may that continue. This one, or these two, and it comes down to which one to actually focus on. This one's from Foster King via Discord. He wants to know, question for Lawrence, how much freedom do you have as a journalist working for F1? Is there ever anything that they ask you to avoid, specifically cover, etc., or does it mostly allow you to do as you please? But also, he points out, don't ask about Will Buxton. So it's kind of at the point, do we have a Will Buxton love-in, or do you want to answer the first question?
What does he mean by don't ask about Will Buxton?
Well, he's more him wanting not to ask because I think he's such a Will Buxton fan, and obviously you and him have worked so closely recently.
Okay. Well, the first one is I've never been told that I can't write something, so I've never filed anything, or there's never been a subject where I've suggested it and they've said no, you can't do that. But then I do think it's probably just a bit of common sense about what you think you can do and what you can't do. My focus at Formula 1 is about the people, it's about the drivers, it's about the personalities, it's about telling their stories and trying to give fans a closer look as to who the people are behind the helmet. So I suppose that's never going to be too tricky. There are obviously areas whereby I don't speculate about which races are going to be on the calendar, but I don't feel like I'm losing out on that sense. There's plenty of other publications out there who cover those stories very well. I suppose I'm more focused on the writing side of things, from a feature point of view. On the broadcasting side of things, we're free to have our opinions. So I've never really felt like I need to worry about what I'm going to say, other than whatever I say, I'm completely comfortable that the person who I'm saying it about will hear it and be okay with it, because in the sense that it's a fair thing to say. I don't think that you should say anything unless you truly believe it, and so as long as you back what you say, I think that's perfectly fine. And on Will, I love working with Will. I've known him for a long time. My first Formula 1 race was with the British Only Reporter competition when he was working as the head of comms for GP2, and so I met him then, and that was 2006, and that is quite cool that I'm working with him however many years that is later, 14 years later, no more than that, 16 years later. My maths was so much shorter. But it was it's great to work with him. He's such a great ball of energy. He was very supportive when I kind of moved on to the broadcasting side of things. And he made it very easy when we were kind of a duo to start with during those COVID times. So I love working with him, and I'd happily talk about Will all day long.
A Will Buxton podcast would be great. Harry, just a quick one on your side. If you cross paths with Will yet? I know that you're in Biggin Hill quite often. He was there doing F1 TV not long ago.
He was. First weekend I met him was in Imola, so a couple of weekends ago. And we sat and chatted for ages, and he gave me so much advice. He's the loveliest man ever. He does love a dramatic pause, even in real life. So that's not just a Netflix thing; it's a real life thing as well. But I've watched Will obviously and listened to him for years as well. So it's you always get a bit tentative about, oh God, are they going to be okay when you meet them in person for the first time? But he was nothing but welcoming, happy to chat, nice. It just makes you feel at home straight away. So big up the Buxton.
Big up the Buxton. I know Floris is a massive fan, so between the two of you, I'm going to somehow worm him onto the podcast somehow for the future as a present to him. But yeah, I think Tyler's going to echo those thoughts, but we're going to run out of time, else we would have just the Ask Will Buxton questions part of the podcast, because he is an F1 feeder series legend, isn't he? But for now, I have to say thank you. That's all the time we have for this week. Thank you, everybody, for watching and listening. If you'd like to have your question asked on a future episode, use the hashtag AskF1FS on Twitter. Drop any questions below if you're watching on YouTube, or let us know what questions you have on your mind on our Discord. Look for the Podcast Questions channel. If you are watching on YouTube, dropping a like on the video, leaving a comment and subscribing all really helps us out. And if you're listening, leaving a review on the podcast platform you're listening on is greatly appreciated. Finally, check out f1feederseries.com for more feeder series insight, including that ADAC F4 stuff I mentioned earlier, and follow F1 Feeder Series 1, F1FS Americas, and F1FS Live on Twitter. You can find the links to all of those, plus the Twitter accounts for myself and everyone else on the podcast, in the YouTube description or the podcast show notes. Until next time, we have been the F1 Feeder Series podcast. Goodbye.